Yeah, hi.
We are not live on YouTube yet, are we?
No, we will get the message and then I'll start all the. Okay.
Although, oh, is it now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, let's
So
go.
it's time to start. And let me introduce our today's event. We are live from the Center for Urban History, though it's online, of course. And today we have the pleasure to have a lecture by Dr. Marії Віноградова. And the title of this lecture is Amateur Filmmaking in the Soviet Union, a Culture and an Industry. And this lecture is connected, of course, to the exhibition that we host at the Center for Urban History Society with the movie camera, which specifically dwells on these issues of amateur filmmaking and also collection of private home films and so on. So those who couldn't see the exhibition, please visit us after the lockdown will be released, since now we are in the restricted area, but of course for all those online participants it doesn't it doesn't matter. So let me introduce Marija Vinogradova, our today's presenter. I had the pleasure to meet her before she defended her PhD, and she also delivered a talk on amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union, and it was in Budapest. And I have to admit that sometimes conferences are very good for spreading networks of people, and since then I've been kind of following Maria's career, and she defended her PhD, if I'm not mistaken, with distinction. So it's a case, and was very good scientific work, and we are looking forward to see her book, since she is currently working on her manuscript with the title On the Public Rails, A History of Soviet Amateur Filmmaking, 1957-1991. So basically, the whole history of Soviet amateur filmmaking will be in this. The first history of the Soviet filmmaking will be in this book. In general, Dr. Vinogradova is a film and media historian, and she specializes in the study of Soviet film culture. And particularly, she is interested in nonfiction and amateur films, their creation, distribution, circulation, and afterlife in the post-Soviet or post-celluloid era, whatever we call it. Her research has been twice supported by American Council of Learned Societies fellowships. She has taught courses in film history, theory, and research methods at Pratt Institute and Brooklyn College. And she produced The Village Detective, a song cycle, in 2021. And this is an experimental documentary on the Soviet actor Mikhail Zharov, directed by Bill Morrison, famous American filmmaker. So I think basically there are much more things to say about Maria, but can highlight this herself as she is. And I have the pleasure and honor to invite Maria for this lecture.
Thank you for this introduction, Bogdan. Good evening. I am very thrilled to speak within this event organized by the institution I admire, Lviv Center for Urban History, which has built a remarkable collection of amateur films right now, and organized the exhibition society with a movie camera, which I would love to have a chance to see, but so far I've seen the documentation, I've seen the trailer you shot and some of the stills, and that look looks really impressive. So today I will provide a historical overview of amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union, and this history will be far from complete, but I will cover some of the milestones, and also show a short film and a clip. So I will illustrate my talk with slides so that you have something to look at, and also that will help me to make sure the names are understood correctly. So I will play from here. So why should we care about amateur filmmaking? Again, it seems to me that the exhibition has already provided some compelling examples, in particular of the way that these films work as a source of historical evidence, the source of knowledge about the era that has passed. And the more time passes, the more we reevaluate the significance of these films. It is well known that amateur films find themselves in this ambiguous place because typically we preserve films for reasons such as aesthetic significance or the significance as a historical source. However, the way we define the historical source is currently in motion. So what is the significance of daily life accounts shot by ordinary people, not the celebrities that are this kind of binding cultural figures for the society? So I will talk about that a little more. At the same time, amateurism itself is a peculiar phenomenon, and it is this phenomenon, our understanding of it continues to evolve today, because amateurism and its other professionalism are related to the nature and world of work. So I composed a list of keywords or buzzwords here associated with with professionalism and amateurism. So for in terms of professional creators, we talk about work. Amateurs create at leisure. So the duality of work and leisure continues to return and be significant in our discussions of it. Also, production versus consumption. What does this mean? Professional filmmakers produce films. Amateur filmmakers, what do they produce? On the one hand, they do produce films, but at the same time, they're also consumers for equipment produced for them. And film historian Patricia Zimmerman, in her pioneering account of the social history of amateur filmmaking in the United States, has described the ways in which in the 1930s, as well as the subsequent decades, the idea of amateur filmmaking was largely promoted by companies that manufactured this equipment. So amateurs occupy this ambiguous place between producers of audiovisual images and consumers of equipment. Which one is more important? It is hard to tell. Then for professionals, professionals create the works of art or works with broad significance. Amateurs create artifacts. So the films that survive are artifacts of a bygone era that are hard to evaluate. So it takes much more effort to discover what it is that makes them significant. Also, professionalism is associated with innovation, whereas amateurism is associated with imitations. So a lot of amateur works, in particular films created in the genre of fiction, imitate the big Hollywood productions or other professional productions. This is not always the case. And this is what makes this history so interesting, because there are a lot of the ways in a lot of diversions from this pattern, but the pattern continues to be significant. So amateur and its other professional. And in today's world, we also see a different way in which amateurism and professionalism blend. So we see in the world of online content, the contribution of amateurs is significant. So can we even say that what Instagram bloggers and influencers create is leisure? No, it is obviously work. So is there even room for amateurism these days? And I think one of the benefits of studying amateur creative practices of the past is to better understand what is happening in the present. But for now, we will delve into the past. And here I will provide a quick overview of the history of amateur filmmaking. It is primarily driven by the development of technology. So we count this history from 1922, 1923, when 16mm film was introduced by Kodak, and around the same time 9.5mm film was introduced by Pathé. Now these are this kind of films are what we call narrow or small gauge. They are much more compact than the professional standard 35mm film. It means that they use a lot less film stock, which is really costly. And for amateurs, it is a drastic way to cut the cost of filmmaking. And at the same time, the equipment is more compact and likewise more affordable. And by the 1930s, 16mm filmmaking is really turning into a culture alongside 9.5, which became obsolete earlier than 16mm, but was also significant. In English language literature, it's often referred to as the French format or French gauge. Then in 1932, Kodak also introduced 8mm film, so it is even more compact than 16. And the difference between these gauges is that 16mm is probably the most versatile among them, because while it was initially aimed for amateurs, it also was embraced by industrial filmmakers and non-fiction filmmakers, and subsequently after the 1950s and 60s by experimental filmmakers. The process that had started back in the 1930s. And also in 1931, we see the birth of UNICA, or Union Internationale du Cinéma Amateur. So the very important international organization that turned amateur filmmaking into an international movement. So here are a few more highlights from the history of UNICA. So in 1931, the first international amateur film competition gathers in Brussels with participation from 5 countries. Then 1933 is the UNICA Festival in Amsterdam. 1934, the gathering in Paris now brought together 17 national federations. And
yeah, can I interrupt you for a second? Because we have only one screen of your presentation. Do you change slides? Because we don't see it.
Which one do you see right now?
The first one, like the very first.
Yeah. So right now, do you see my slide? I think I will just.
Yeah, now we see.
I just would like to remove that, but it doesn't seem to be going away. I don't know why it wouldn't switch. Okay, so I will just keep it this way to make sure it is visible. Okay, well, this is too bad because I had this and this. But all right, let's move on. Thank you for the heads up. Okay, So what was happening in the Soviet Union? So in the Soviet Union, the significant factor that made this culture different from the way it was developing in Europe and North America and many other parts of the world is that small gauge filmmaking equipment did not become available there, broadly available there until the 1960s. So, but the idea of filmmaking by amateurs emerged as early as the 1920s. So, for instance, Dziga Vertov was developing the Kino Eye circles, and his idea was to make sure that each of these circles all over the country had a film camera. And also, Society of Friends of Soviet Cinema, founded in 1926, pursued a similar goal. So it develops and supports amateur clubs all over the country. Its activities were wrapped up in 1932, the time when much of the diversity, of the cultural diversity of the early Soviet period of 1920s gave way to this more rigid structure and control during the time of high Stalinism. So it's not that nothing was happening until the mid 1955, but I will skip to the until the mid of 1950s. But I will skip to the moment that is often called the second birth of Soviet amateur filmmaking, because for over 2 decades it was close to non-existent. Very few people owned film cameras. Usually those were the ones that were privileged enough to travel abroad, where they could buy those cameras. Sometimes those cameras could also come up in secondhand stores, but then also it was not so easy to get film stock for them. There were no laboratories, so it was an extremely elaborate process to shoot, develop, and present a film. So what happened in 1957? First of all, so the most visible event of that year was a screening of an international program of amateur films within 6th World Festival of Students and Youth in Moscow. And I will skip to this slide here that illustrates, that shows some images from the festival. Again, after so it was, this event is a highlight of Khrushchev's thaw and the first occasion on which Soviet people could meet people from all over the world, even though many of those encounters were supervised by officials. So it featured various kinds of performances and exhibitions, but one among them was a 3-day conference with a screening of amateur films from different countries. So at the same time, in 1957, film professionals create a founding committee for a union of filmmakers, and it immediately opens a section for amateur film within it. And the film director Grigory Rochal, a chief advocate of amateur filmmaking, leads this section. And what the section does is it's trying to address the situation in which amateur film technologies were virtually unavailable. So they are coordinating industrial and state bodies to develop domestic production of small gauge equipment, because again, amateur filmmaking is first of all embraces the films shot on 16:8 and 9.5 millimeter film. So, and here is a still from a professionally shot documentary called "I'm a Film Amateur," produced in 1964 at the Central Studio of Documentary Films in Moscow. So it is the film is focusing on the development of amateur filmmaking at the time, showing the diversity of highlighting the diversity of films that were being produced. So in addition to the beginning of production of the domestic production of amateur equipment, there are various other measures that are undertaken to provide support for amateur filmmaking. So the section for amateur film at the Union of Filmmakers coordinates connections with various organizations, but especially VCSPS, this all-state Committee of Trade Unions, also Central Television, as well as industrial, trade, and military authorities. So for Central Television in particular, the pool of amateur filmmakers was important at the time when television was a new medium and it needed content. So oftentimes, and especially on local television stations, amateurs contributed content to programming. Film professionals are also involved with major amateur clubs. They teach workshops for amateurs, offer consultations, and sit in juries of amateur film competitions. So, and a number of professional filmmakers also wrote books for film amateurs. So Mikhail Rom wrote one, and he referred to amateurs as film chroniclers of our times. So there was a certain fascination with the way that broad availability of motion picture cameras creates a unique record of the present for the future. So a kind of a time capsule, I would say. And then also the union. So the Union of Filmmakers had a section for international connections, and that section develops relations with international amateur film organizations. It organizes film exchanges and coordinates Soviet participation in international amateur film festivals. And I will talk more about this in a few moments. Now, the role of trade unions. Again, they provided material support to amateur filmmaking along the lines of what was called samodеятельность, which meant amateur arts and other activities. And that means that, of course, it mainly supports amateur filmmaking clubs as opposed to individuals. So a number of Soviet books published on the topic of amateur filmmaking say that individual film amateurs are the most numerous, but amateur film clubs represent the face of Soviet amateur filmmaking. The Council of Trade Unions also has a film section, and it organizes local, regional, and national amateur film festivals. It also regularly sends inspectors to regions to report on the state of development of amateur filmmaking there. And in 1973, it institutes the title of People's Film Studio, granted to the strongest collectives. People's film studios are entitled to additional material support and employ one or more paid staff members. So, and this is the situation in which amateur filmmaking of the period of second birth is developing. So as I have mentioned, the Sixth International Festival of Youth and Students was really important for the development of Soviet amateur filmmaking, because the success of that screening was used by advocates of amateur filmmaking as evidence of its importance, as a way to reason that indeed it needs to be supported by both producing amateur cameras and also supporting individual clubs. And at the same time, this excitement about the international reach of amateur filmmaking can be seen within the amateur movement in other countries. So here are some of the headlights from the British magazine Amateur Cineworld. So we see lots of enthusiasm about the way that creating films and showing them internationally enables people at the time when international travel was less common than it became it became in the 1980s and especially today. So their ability to connect with their counterparts in other parts of the world and to show their culture through showing films. And also a number of publications in British and French and possibly other journals are dedicated to amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union. So here is an article contributed by Yakov Talchan to the French publication the title escapes me. I will tell it to you a little bit. Le cinéma pratique chez soi. So pretty much practical cinema at home, and that's in September, October 1962. Yakov Talchan was a very significant cinematographer whose career began as he was working with Dziga Vertov in the 1920s. And in the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s, he was one of the professionals who were enthusiastic supporters of amateur film. So he often represented Soviet amateurs abroad. Then again, Grigory Rochal, whom I have mentioned, is interviewed also by Le Cinéma Pratique chez soi in 1963. And Amateur Cineworld in the same year is publishing a piece titled A Free 35mm Cine Camera and 10 rubles a year. That was actually also a translation from Cinéma Pratique chez soi, so they translated it from French. But a part of the title is something that should be clarified. So they're talking about amateurs shooting on 35mm film. So early in my talk, I have mentioned that the development of small gauge film technology was crucial for the development of amateur filmmaking. So 35mm amateur filmmaking also existed in the Soviet Union. So before 16 and 8mm cameras had become available, one of the ways to make films was to become friends with a local newsreel studio or another professional studio and get equipment there. Sometimes those studios had old cameras that they were no longer using. So instead, they could just give them to a local studio. But then, of course, the studio had to develop the films somewhere. So it would bring them back to the professional studio and again ask for a favor. And professional studios also shared the film stock. And in the late 1950s, so there are a lot of archival documents surviving that I have consulted in various state archives in Moscow that contain discussions of various, at various conferences dedicated to the development of amateur filmmaking. So one of the examples at one such conference says, okay, so as a film professional working at a film studio, I get lots of calls every day from amateurs asking to help with developing films. How much longer can that continue? Let's develop the amateur facilities. So again, supporting amateur film meant more than producing, manufacturing cameras and projectors. It also involved manufacturing film stock and also creating an infrastructure for developing film. So This is what makes me think of a phrase that Dziga Vertov wrote in his 1947 memoir. He wrote, "I spent my entire life building a locomotive, but never built a system of rails for it." So by the locomotive, he means the efforts he was putting back in the 1920s towards developing amateur filmmaking, towards raising a pool of news reporters out of non-professionals, but the infrastructure was not there. So the system of rails was not there yet. And what was happening after 1957 was building a system of rails, an infrastructure that allowed for a variety of films to be created all over the country. And while my research has mainly focused on Russia, and I have to say that I haven't traveled everywhere where I would like to go to places with strong amateur film cultures, but the system that was created back then worked in similar ways in different Soviet republics, although of course there were national aspects, national differences in each region. So in the Baltic countries, for instance, there was a certain preponderance towards experimental films, for instance. Also, there was some pretty old amateur film studios in Ukraine that had existed since the 1930s, associated with industrial factories. And I don't know if there are any extant films from them, but again, amateur film cultures are older than the public, the system of public rails built in the late 1950s, but this is the time when it turned into a mass phenomenon, into a movement. And so on the one hand, there was, by 1957, there was a certain demand from people interested in filmmaking, a demand for equipment and film stock. At the same time, if once equipment was manufactured, the idea of filmmaking itself had to be promoted to the public. And that's a little bit similar to the way Kodak and other companies were doing it in the 1930s in the United States and Europe. So we are making equipment, we should make you interested in consuming that equipment. So in the Soviet Union, the idea of amateur filmmaking was also popularized in a variety of ways. On the one hand, to interest more people in it. On the other hand, to persuade authorities that indeed it was something worth of support. And one of the ways to argue for the importance of amateur filmmaking was to highlight films made by artists and celebrities. So on the one hand, celebrities were some of the early adopters of amateur filmmaking, due to the fact that they were that privileged minority that was able to travel abroad. On the other hand, the films actually often were of sufficiently high quality, often due to the fact that they were trained in a different artistic discipline. So this was the case of Stanislav Vlasov, who was a ballet dancer and a soloist at the Bolshoi Theater. It seems that he was traveling abroad as early as 1955, according to some publications in newspapers that I could find. And at that time, he was in his early 20s. And he had a film camera, probably bought in a second-hand store or bought abroad. I don't know the details of that, but he made a number of films. So his tour of Scandinavia, the tour of the United Kingdom, his trip to New York, and they were shown in Moscow. They were screened publicly, and some of the old amateurs I have interviewed told me that one of the reasons to attend amateur film screenings that it was possible to see foreign countries in them. It was such a novelty at that time that such screenings really gathered full theaters. So here are a few more stills from the film I Am a Film Amateur, again from 1964, made at the Central Studio of Documentary Films, that show Stanislav Vlasov and Lyudmila Bogomolova, his wife at the time and also the stage partner, packing for a tour abroad. And I don't know how well it is visible in the stills, but actually they have curtains made of strips of 16mm film. And the voiceover narrator says, you can recognize a true amateur at once. So here are the curtains, and they pack their filmmaking equipment before they pack their ballet clothes. So this is how they are introduced. Another significant amateur was Leonid Maslyukov, who was a circus artist from a dynasty of the Maslyukov acrobats. And he was also one of the most seasoned amateurs who was shooting since at least 1964. So back in the 40s, he already was traveling abroad in support of various cultural missions. He was also included into the group of those who went to the famous Tehran conference. And he was shooting on 16mm. He had a Bolex, so that's the high end, the top end of 16mm cameras, and he used it for everything. He filmed his tours abroad. He also filmed his company, some of the working moments, and he also used it to document, technical aspects of performances. So yeah, he was also very strong. And here you can see that he's hanging on a tree with an amateur, a small gauge film camera. So his partner on stage, in life, on stage, and in filmmaking was his wife Tamara Ptitsina. And Maslyukov and Ptitsina created a program in the early 1960s titled Sine Stories, or Kinoraskazy in Russian. And the program consisted in, so in the beginning of the program, they would film the spectators in the audience. Then someone, usually Tamara Ptitsina herself, would bring the roll of film to the lab while Maslyukov was performing his routines on the stage. They also included shots from their foreign trips. So perhaps you can see in this poster that there are images of the Eiffel Tower, and I think it's an elephant, and the Taj Mahal, and some other famous locations that they showed on film. But at the very end of the program, they would bring the film back from the lab, the one they shot in the very beginning, and show to the audience the shots of themselves. And that just looked like a miracle that was immensely popular. So Maslyukov is one example of someone who creatively incorporated amateur filmmaking into his main work. And Stanislav Vlasov also later in the 1970s created a dance program that included film projection. So again, a lot of amateurs subsequently pursued multimedia form where film was one of the media they employed. And amateur film studios were opening everywhere. So one of the common places were institutions of higher education. And here is a shot from I Believe in Spring, directed by Vladislav Zuckerman, one of the founders of MISI Film, which was the amateur film studio of Moscow Institute of Construction and Engineering. So this is their first film, shot in 1961 on 16 millimeter, and it's about 10 minutes long. So Zuckerman subsequently became a student. So here are some of the images from the making of this film. And Zuckerman subsequently studied at VGIK, the main film school, although his department was of science film, and his mentors were Lev Kuleshov and Ekaterina Khokhlova. And also mostly his most famous work is the cult midnight movie titled Liquid Sky from 1982 that he shot in New York after he immigrated there. So here are some of the credits. Some of the credits for the film. The cinematography was by Yuri Neyman, who creatively worked with black light and neon lights for the film to this striking effect. But again, the roots of Zuckerman as a film director are in amateur filmmaking. And a number of film professionals actually supported amateur filmmaking, not because they were interested in the films themselves, but because they thought it was an important way to train future professionals. And they insisted that applicants to film schools should present their amateur works in order to be considered. So I will now show a short film from another studio at a higher education institution, and that's called Sport and Humor, made in Kharkiv by HPI Film, so Kharkiv Polytechnic Institute. It's an animation on 35 films. So HPI Film was one of those studios that worked on the professional 35 millimeter gauge, and it was often called the VGIK of Kharkiv, and some of the alumni of the studio subsequently also went to work in Hollywood. So there is this humorous short film animation film that is making fun of Soviet cliches related to sport. And I will try to make it full screen right now. Bogdan, please tell me if there is an issue with projecting the film. So I'm clicking the play button. Is it okay?
We don't see video. We have sound.
Oh, okay. So I will.
Maybe the same way as you.
I will just screen it this way.
Yeah, this way maybe. Yeah, here we see.
And the topic of Adam and Eve in the late Soviet culture deserves a separate dissertational book. So this is one example. But right now, I would like to talk more about technology. Again, I announced my talk as the one discussing both the culture and the industry, because the industry part is very important. So I have mentioned that the idea of amateur filmmaking was promoted both to the authorities in search of support, of material support, but also to potential amateurs themselves, because once the manufacturing of film cameras started, they had to go somewhere. So this is a recent discovery, and from what I know, the film was rediscovered in 2019. Prior to that, it was believed to be lost. So everyone who was growing up in the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet countries knows this cartoon called "Ну погоди" or "Well, Just You Wait," about the hare and the wolf. In the urban settings, similar to Tom and Jerry in the story, the hare is constantly chased by the wolf and has to rely on a variety of tactics to escape him. So the series was so popular that when it came to advertising amateur film cameras, the producers at Soyuz Multfilm, the animation film studio, actually went ahead and cast the hare and the wolf in that commercial made in 1975. So we can see that the hare is standing here outside of the window of a store that sells film and photo cameras, and gets really excited. And here we see a close-up of the quartz camera. Those cameras were manufactured by the Krasnogorsk factory outside of Moscow. And this is an 8mm camera. Empowered by it, the hare, of course, goes ahead and spies on the wolf, whom he finds inside his room. That he's shooting from the tree through the window, and the wolf is, of course, disempowered by this intrusion. So this also borders on this idea of hunting with a camera instead of a gun, especially well known by another cartoon, A Vacation on Prostokvashino from 1980, and the camera gun was also manufactured by the Krasnogorsk factory. So this is the Photo Sniper series. Again, this is for still cameras, but the idea of using motion picture cameras for shooting, for hunting, was also promoted. And I see that its extension is also in the idea of surveillance. So amateurs often struggle to find an application to their hobby. So one way to make it useful was to fight the ills of society. So here are a couple of excerpts from a 1969 book titled "I'm a Film Amateur." So it's giving an example of one amateur who, I quote, walked across a forest strip and a city park, stood for a few hours by a factory gate, peeked inside a grocery store that sold vodka. In short, you understand what he ended up with. So he knew where to look for subjects to hunt with a movie camera. As you see, a film camera in the hands of a film amateur is far from being a toy. It is a powerful weapon, and carrying this weapon requires a special kind of citizen courage, especially if you carry it openly without hiding. So that was one idea for which amateur filmmaking was promoted. And I have to say, I haven't found, this was developed as a part of the so-called people's control. And that was an initiative in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev era, where the idea was, to share authority with the citizens who would detect various misdeeds in the daily life, but also in production, for example, the misuse of resources, and so on. So this is one example, but also, yeah, so we find this motif of surveillance in a variety of films. Back to technology. So factories that manufactured amateur equipment in the Soviet Union, the main ones were the Krasnogorsk mechanical factory, the Leningrad optical mechanic factory, or LOMO, then the Petrovsky factory in Kiev, also known as Toch Pribor, that made the Kiev cameras. Moscow Gramophone factory made the 8mm tourist cameras, and the Kazan optical mechanic factory, KOMS, also made a few. What's interesting about those is that these same factories did not produce cameras for professional film industry. So amateur cameras were manufactured on the margins of the military industrial complex as a part of the initiative to create consumer goods. So the distinctions I outlined in the beginning of my talk between the amateur and professional also resonate here with the idea of amateurism pursued at leisure. So amateurs here are put in the position of consumers. And so while it is an interesting situation here when equipment was both abundant and scarce at the same time, because those who experienced being film amateurs at the time described that many cameras and other equipment had to be repaired and improved out of the box. And things that especially needed attention were projector bulbs. And so some of the amateurs who were members of clubs, of factory clubs, who were engineers, were actually able to make their own, or they were able to ask their friends, and sometimes they shared handmade equipment. So this was a system in what the sociologist and economist Alena Ledeneva calls the economy of favors. But at the same time, it was a part of the initiative, again, that was developing in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev era, called the technical creativity, or people's technical creativity. It was a way to stimulate innovation in the centrally planned economy, and there were exhibitions of these amateur devices. At the same time, a lot of creators of such devices didn't necessarily send them to exhibitions, so they continued to be created for oneself and sometimes reproduced for friends. And sociologists and anthropologists have actually described this phenomenon of using factory equipment for one's own needs. So, for example, the French sociologist Michel de Certeau called them la perruque, or the wig, and it's a practice in which a job or artifact is executed for workers' own purposes using materials, tools, and industrial facilities at the place of employment and during work time. Then another anthropologist, Michel Anteby, called them homers, and cultural historian Olga Smolyak also mentioned that in the Soviet Union, such practices were generally acceptable, appearing as a conventionally sanctioned privatization of work time and industrial resources. So we can also see one other example of the ways in which work and leisure blend in that amateur filmmaking within the system of state-supported studios. Now, while this domestically produced equipment was often of poor quality, at the same time, these cameras were exported abroad. And oftentimes there were goods of the special export quality. So the ambassador camera was manufactured by Lomo, and they were both advertised but also reviewed in international publications. So this is a review in Amateur Cineworld in 1964. And another one of the quartz camera in 1966. Quartz cameras were by the Lomo factory in Leningrad. And the way, what reviewers often wrote about these cameras was that they were simple, no frills, but very reliable and with good optics. And it seems that to the veterans of the amateur movement who wrote for amateur cine world, such as Ivan Watson, whose amateur filmmaking experience came back from the 1930s, that was the kind of equipment they liked, because at that time in the 1960s, increased automation in cameras. So there was a certain anxiety associated with it, that the human factor was no longer important. So for the veterans of the movement, Soviet cameras were the ones they were looking for. What if I do it this way? I think it looks a little better. So again, the cameras are both abundant and scarce. Again, there are often film amateurs describe their practice as consisting in 3 parts. So the films they make for the factory, also for oneself, so home movies, for the factory, meaning films related to their work, and for creativity. So often those included fiction and experimental films. And here is a still from, let's go back to this view from the film Amator, or Camera Buff, by the Polish director Krzysztof Kieślowski, that he directed in 1979. And he is describing this kind of situation. So the protagonist, by Jerzy Sztur, gets an 8mm camera with the birth of his daughter. Once the factory director finds out that he's making films, he's asking him if he could also do some filmmaking for the needs of the factory, because a delegation is coming. So this is how a studio is founded at the factory, and it gets a 16mm camera, Krasnogorsk, from the Krasnogorsk factory in Moscow. I will not show the clip because I know that we are not doing very well on time. But again, so the system of state patronage was both a source of opportunity but also restriction. So if we look at the private collections, and that is the main source of amateur films these days in Russia, but I know that's the case also in Ukraine and other formerly Soviet republics, we see a lot of this factory films, and it's easy to get an impression that this was the main kind of films produced, but they were the most visible ones, while still 8mm cameras were the most numerous. And this culture was the output of this culture was pretty diverse. So here is a still from a film shared with me by the Center for Urban History, a home movie by Greg Poritsky on 8mm, who was an artist and a hippie, significant on the Lviv scene. And I don't know the exact year, perhaps Alexander and Bogdan could remind us later, but there were all sorts of underground filmmaking in the 70s. So, and actually the hippie culture was a significant producer of those movies, because one aspect of this culture, it was obsession with self-documentation. And but it's hard also, it's hard to talk about it as an underground, because I mean it was underground filmmaking, but it was so underground that it didn't really have much of an audience outside of the filmmaker's immediate circle. So it was only in the 1980s that the so-called parallel cinema began to develop. And what was different was not the fact that the filmmakers could make films, but that they could show them to the audience. So the Cine Phantom journal in Moscow, published by the Aleynikov brothers, was a very important publication. And similar filmmakers associated with that new film underground were emerging in other cities as well, but in many cases they were relying on the same infrastructure of the state amateur film studios. So they called it a relationship of a parasitic relationship, because by the 80s, many of the studios were abandoned, and this is when they got inhabited by the underground, who became more public and more visible. So, but there is lots yet to be discovered about 8mm filmmaking in the 1970s. And I will skip a few more slides, but I would like to say a few more words about the state of archives of amateur films. And so I think the initiative by the Center for Urban History in Lviv is really unique in the post-Soviet space, because the work of collecting, preserving, and disseminating films is yet to be done, again, for a variety of institutional restrictions, and often just the conservatism and lack of interest. These films are often neglected by formal film archives, so it takes private initiative to bring them to the surface. So in Moscow, one of the most significant collections is of the former amateur film club that now occupies a basement in its former building. And what was significant about it is that it had a library of award-winning films. So by now, what survives is only a small part of that library. It was preserved by efforts of Daniel Jejerun, who sadly passed away last October. And right now, the collection is overseen by his collaborators from the club. But back at the time when Daniel was overseeing it, it was a place to view films on 35, 16, and 8mm film. He had all the projectors and kept everything in a perfect order. So again, other smaller collections exist in various parts of the former Soviet Union. Also, there are a lot of local museums who have films on their collection, but they never mention them because film is still viewed as something exotic and obscure. So it takes a lot of active approach to discover those films. And this is something I will be talking more about at the seminar on November 18th. Right now, I thank you for your attention, and I will gladly take questions if you have any.
Thank you, Maria, for this extensive and very interesting and very needed talk. We recorded, and if you will agree, we will use it also for the educational purposes. We aim at the end also to develop probably a course on amateur filmmaking in Europe, in Soviet Union also. I have a few questions, if my colleagues also can join. So simply you can raise your hand or speak up. My questions are related to several issues. One of which is probably of my ignorance. I know that the Krasnogorsk is also a place of the former Soviet and now Russian archives. Yes, is it by chance, accident, that the archive was also located in the place where these famous cameras were produced? So yeah, my question is whether this production somehow is connected to archival practices. And if yes, then why actually these amateur archives were not located there also, but they are somewhere in other places? And I'm asking this question and I can't find I can't find any answers. You showed this beautiful example of the Adam and Eve, and then some glimpses of the naked body on the amateur film. But we also know that the body, or whatever corporeality, was kind of restricted issue in the Soviet Union. And we also know that the camera was a very liberating force. So often people would kind of undress and record each other. And we, in our collection, we don't have these materials, which brings kind of two possible readings. Like one is that people were afraid either to digitize or to show this kind of materials. Another issue is that probably they were not doing these recordings, like, you know, the bodies and investigating of corporeality. And maybe you know something about it. And my third question, sorry for so many questions, but we have in general this amateurism as an attitude and development. And I also know that Soviet Union was producing video cameras, not only for the industrial, but also for the private usage. And we don't have this discourse about the video in general. We know mainly about films and film cameras. Do you know why? And maybe there are some other stories related to video as technology and media that you can highlight in this talk. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for these questions, Bogdan. I'll move in the order in which you asked them. So Krasnogorsk, the factory and the archive, it seems to be a coincidence. I went on a tour of the museum of the Krasnogorsk factory this September, and I asked them the same question. And they do know some people working at the archive. Also, Krasnogorsk factory had its own amateur film studio. So some of its films are now at the archive, and the archive itself also had an amateur film studio. So, but yes, it seems like a coincidence, but an interesting one. The body is a big question. So you're saying that you know that people were filming themselves naked, and again, you probably know that from the films of the like of Greg Paritsky, right? The hippies active in the 70s. I have to say I haven't seen a lot of those films. So I did see the Paritsky films on YouTube. There is a playlist there right now, and I know that in Latvia there were also some films featuring nudity, and most likely they were made elsewhere. Sometimes, sometimes I browse the internet and try to find evidence of amateur erotic films or pornography even being shot, and there are scarce mentionings, but very few specific information. Once I also came across a collection sold on one online listings website, the Russian equivalent of Craigslist, that claimed that it had both photographs and motion pictures, and that it was softcore pornography. I asked if there were any amateur films, and the seller said there could have been, but she was only willing to sell the whole collection. So I couldn't see that. But I think it would take a lot of targeted approach to detect those films. As to the reasons why people who made them are not, making them visible, I think so. I mean, I can only guess, but I imagine that few people want to show their early works, and it was a long time ago, right? It's often it's a personal subject, and people are not necessarily proud of that. People featured in those films don't necessarily want them to be shown, or perhaps they're sitting somewhere in the attic or cellar, and the filmmaker has so many other concerns that they just don't simply digitize the films. You know what it's like. Whenever I have to move to a new place and move my things, I often think about why it's not surprising that so many home movies get lost, because it's easy to say that they are important, but it's also difficult to keep your personal archives. So I think it's a combination of these factors, but also one of the important factors is that the films were never very visible. during their lifetime. So, in Britain, for instance, there were makers of the so-called glamour films that amateur cine world highlighted sometimes. So they were exhibited publicly. And when something is visible, it has a place in the public memory, even if it's a very small place. When something is completely obscure, just sitting somewhere in the attic, while the maker is aging, it really depends on the circumstances. So I hope we'll be able to find these various films, but I think it's also important to promote the idea of preserving and showing these films from the past, the way you are doing at your center right now, so that more people can get an idea that their films actually have a place somewhere. So that would be my answer to your question. And regarding video cameras, again, I also toured the museum of the Lomo factory, and they showed me some of the Lomo video cameras, which pretty much look like copies of the Sony's Portapak camera, first introduced in 1969. And of course, I forgot to mention that a lot of the cameras made by Soviet factories were copies or close approximations of German or Japanese cameras. Initially, there were actually some conversations about whether we should adopt the standard gauges or we should create our own Soviet gauge that no one has seen. But of course, the question of standardization quickly became a non-issue, because if the goal was to make amateur filmmaking broadly available, then it had to be standardized. It had to be as simple as possible. So, but I think to any writer of the history of amateur filmmaking, one of the first questions is when to stop. And often we stop at the end of the celluloid era. So Patricia Zimmerman stopped in the late 1960s. For her, the arrival of Super 8 cameras meant and even more increased automation and standardization. It was the end of amateur films and the complete victory of home movies. But others, like Norris Nicholson in the United Kingdom, went further into the 1970s. Of course, we could include the video, but also it's a different kind of medium. And I have some examples of amateurs who switched from celluloid to video, also making not just local documentations, but feature length or short features, fiction films shot on VHS. But VHS, of course, is more difficult to preserve than amateur film, and than celluloid. And unlike 16 or 8 millimeter, you can record over your VHS. So I think it's just a lot more fragile gauge, but at the same time, also it has its own medium specificity, and perhaps it should be a separate history. But when it comes to the question of circulation of old amateur films and home movies, many of us who have researched them have noticed that the digital copies we have with the missing originals actually come from VHS. So some of the film amateurs transferred their films to VHS, and from VHS to digital, and the original is lost. So VHS also has some, has something to say about the way we view amateur films today. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. We have also in our collection one piece which was screened. We call them screen copies. So projected on the prostenia, the silk screen, whatever, homemade screen, and then recorded on digital media. And that's why we have them, but not originals. Okay, Oles, please.
Yes, thank you, Maria, for a fascinating lecture, and as well as all your text. We are really looking forward for your book, and the texts were very important and inspiring for us while we were making our research. So it's indeed pioneering work, and you're using a lot of text sources and archive in your research. So I would like to ask about the discussions in these official source about the content of the films. Do they discuss the live action films and documentaries? This is the first part of the question. And the second one, what was the discourse regarding the 8mm format? Because as I understand, they consider the 16mm as more important for amateur filmmaking in that time. And what was about the 8mm on this official level? So that's for the beginning.
Thank you, Les. I'll actually begin with the 8mm question, if you don't mind, because it's really intriguing for me as well. So I have mentioned in my talk that 8mm films tend to be more abundant, but at times also more difficult to discover, because I mean, the whole movie day, which I know you have been organizing as well, I think is a good way to discover them. But it takes a lot of working with individual subjects, whereas collections of factory films and other organized films that were usually made on 16mm and not 8, they exist in one place. So it involves a different kind of research, and I hope that both will be conducted. But for 8mm, so I know that in Leningrad, for instance, in the 80s, there was a studio called Mini Film that shot exclusively on 8mm, and they said all the 16mm films, they're so the 16mm cameras, they're so heavy. Those who make them are trying to imitate the professionals, but of course the professionals, the makers of 16mm films, were amateurs. So there is an interesting hierarchy here. But it's it seems that for instance, if we take the Super 8mm format, it seems that in the Soviet Union it was not associated with the same kind of rebellious film culture that it came to be in Europe, North America, and Latin America, because it was just another small gauge format. And also what's interesting is that, so we see that the hippie filmmakers and some of the underground artists from the 70s were shooting on 8mm. Yevgeny Yufit, the founder of the necrorealist movement in St. Petersburg in the 1980s, in Leningrad at the time, mentioned to me that so his first films, his first shorts were shot on 8mm film, and now they seem to only circulate as a 35mm blowout with huge scratches on them. And that's another limitation of 8mm film, that it's hard to screen in public. It needs that other print. But Yufit told me that he went to amateur film studios specifically to be able to work with 16mm film. So for many people, 8mm was that intermediary step towards something more significant. But makers of home movies could be using 8mm in their lifetime. I know one other figure, again, in Russia that really intrigues me is called, her name is Klavdia Baranova. He was a member of the Moscow Amateur Film Club. And she was shooting films about nature. She was also known for her work with music and soundtracks, which was very skillful. And she only began making films in retirement. So I don't know much about her private life, whether she had a family, for instance, because for amateurs it often matters. Pierre Bourdieu described amateurs as those strange types that only can dedicate them to amateurism because they don't have a family. So in any case, the history of 8mm also should be a separate one. It should be studied in more detail, and I am still putting effort to that. But it seems that my book will mainly focus on the studios and 16 as well as 35mm films. And the previous question was, could you remind me of this?
It was about the content of the film and the discussion about the content of this amateur film on official level.
That's right. So for the most part, my source of film descriptions are published sources, journals such as Искусство, кіно, or the art of cinema. That was the publication of the Union of Filmmakers. They regularly published pieces about amateur films and discussed them there. Then there were books published by professionals who supported film amateurs. So people like Yakov Talchan, for instance, described films as well. When it comes to description of individual films, so in the 60s, amid those heated debates about the meaning and utility of amateur films, so there are some mentionings of unusual uses of small gauge filmmaking, such as in the Navy, for instance, when someone organized delivery of film letters that sailors sent home. Again, I couldn't find any more about that, but that existed, it seems. But another source I have used is the collection of the trade unions in Moscow at the State Archive that again had a film section, and the section regularly sent inspectors to different parts of the country, all the republics, and after that, upon the trip, they would write a report on the state of amateur filmmaking in the Mariupol area, for example. And so often they included details of the work of the local Central Amateur Film Club, and then usually there was some screening or a festival that the reviewer attended. So they described some of the films. Often the descriptions were pretty harsh. So there is no need for this film to exist. That was the kind of films, the kind of things they could mention. And when I was reading them closely, I already had a list of names of reviewers, and I remembered the harshest ones. Right now, I need to go back to my notes to be able to recall that. But yeah, so film professionals usually discussed amateur films in general. They mentioned highlighted successes of Soviet amateur films at international film festivals. So there are a variety of sources of those descriptions.
Thank you, Maria. There are any further questions from the people who are here in the room? We have silence, which is good and bad at the same time. But I have no, yeah. In YouTube we see there are no questions. But if I may, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Since we record this event, and it would be a good source for further discussions. In our collection at the Center for Urban History, we have only a few examples of the female amateurs. And so my question is again related to gender and social. Do you see any kind of, I don't know, tendency in the Soviet context that the amateurism is probably mainly dominated by males, but again, whether was any kind of specificity with the female filmmaker? And another question that I'd like to raise here is, do you use any kind of Western explanatory models like the Raymond Williams talking about mobile privatization, mobile camera and the home, and that the amateurism connects the both? So do you use these theoretical frames, or you mainly focus on institutional development, studios, and then technology, avoiding these theoretical claims. Thank you.
Yeah, these are big questions, Bogdan, especially the question about women. And it's a tricky one because I think I have seen very few films made by women, just a handful of films, which I think reflects the fact that there were fewer women involved in amateur filmmaking, and B, the ones who were involved in it were more likely to be forgotten. That's something I came to realize as I was researching, because for some of the larger amateur film studios in the digital age, there would be people who still have a memory of the club, and they would build a tribute website. For instance, the HPI film, Kharkiv Polytechnic Institute, whose film I showed during my talk, has this kind of website. Again, focusing on the male founders and participants of the club. There is often some kind of father figure, you know, also the figure that brings people together. And somehow it is very uncommon that this kind of website would be created for a woman. So one figure I am very interested in is Anna Shetinina, who is the first woman captain in the world. So she, in the second part of her life, she lived and taught in Vladivostok, although she was, her first trip as a captain was when she was 26 years old, and that was in 1934, I think, on the ship called Chavicha that's sailed from Germany to the Soviet Union. And so she was one of those strong women from the 30s, like Marina Raskova, who was the first woman pilot, for instance, who were really promoted, who had a high prestige and authority. And when she became a teacher a university professor in Vladivostok, she also organized an amateur film studio there for her students, and she was also making films herself. I came across her, a publication about her in the newspaper Soviet Culture from 1977 or 78. There was an interview with her, and she's expressing very interesting and sophisticated ideas about the ways that people who spend a lot of time at sea have a very special way to look at the world. So they're good candidates for picking up the camera and making films. And that's the point we also see in the case with other amateurs. For instance, Stanislav Vlasov, the ballet dancer I mentioned in my talk, was often praised for his editing skills that were attributed to the fact that his familiarity with choreography allowed for a special kind of space. And that's actually one of the reasons that amateur films are not so easy to discover, is that oftentimes it is such an interdisciplinary practice that it takes a researcher who is also working in more than one area. So again, Anna Shetinina was a very prominent figure in the 20th century, and she was a prominent film amateur, but where are her films? So there are some mentionings of her filmmaking, but I have made a few calls in Vladivostok. I contacted the local museum. I contacted the Captain's Club, where she was a founding member. And no one knows where the films are. Someone told me they were thrown away, but of course I now know that if someone tells me that the films are thrown away, that can still mean that someone picked them up. So it's still not hopeless, but I think the fact that Shetinina did not get, even though she was so influential among her students, somehow she didn't get a tribute website or some kind of memoir that would preserve her film legacy. And I tend to attribute it to the fact that as a woman, she she had a different kind of what do we call it, an outlook or reputation, because a documentary film made about her upon her death actually makes constant allusions to her lack of femininity, for instance. That's right. So, and somehow perhaps amateur filmmaking was not something to be really highlighted here, although there were other films made in her lifetime that presented her as a more multi-dimensional figure. So again, one reason that it is so difficult to find amateur films made by women is that they're less likely to be preserved. And then, of course, it is true that fewer women were making amateur films. Oftentimes, and again, Heather Norris Nicholson wrote a book about amateur filmmaking by women, where she's focusing on the roles of women in the amateur circles that go beyond filmmaking, directing films, camera work, and she finds that a lot of them worked as organizers, for instance. One Soviet book on amateur filmmaking begins somewhere early, mentions that a lot of film amateurs get a lot of objections from their wives, but some of the wives support the amateurs. So, you know, there is this real distinction between film amateurs and their wives. So there is a certain gender identity. So Heather Norris Nicholson proposes to look beyond that. And it's true that a lot of amateur clubs had members who didn't really make films of both genders, so both men and women. Some people just like to go there for the environment. So Daniil Zhezherun, who preserved the collection of the former Moscow Amateur Film Club, was 13 when he first got there in the early 90s. He wasn't making films. He just liked to be there. And it is the case also for a lot of women, but also the separation of labor that exists in the professional industry often extended towards amateur filmmaking as well. In the studios, women were often editors. And one of the old amateurs told me about one editor who worked at the post office and had a perfect visual memory. So he would tell her what needed to be put together, and a few minutes later, she would just bring it to him all ready. So yeah, but then, so again, the different roles of women had in the movement, but then also, of course, the double burden that sociologists have described a lot of women who just don't simply have free time, that they work the second shift at home after their main work, or also those women who did become amateur filmmakers, it was less likely to become a lifetime pursuit. So for instance, they would do it and then they would get busy with their family or other obligations, whereas films that survive by male filmmakers are often by those filmmakers for whom it was a lifelong commitment. So this is the variety of factors that make it difficult to find films by women, but I think we should still keep trying, and we should look beyond the traditional creative roles, such as the director and cameraman, to learn more about the involvement of women in the amateur film movement. So, and then, of course, I would appreciate a reminder about the other question you asked me, Bogdan.
I feel that you are tired, but this was about these famous, often used theoretical frames, like Raymond Williams's definition of mobile privatization, these new devices, and the modernity itself with these mobile devices. They change the feeling of home, and also this social. They restructure the social, and so the question is whether you also use these kind of bigger theoretical frames, or your focus on Soviet amateurism is mainly on studios and then on technology.
So there is not one big theoretical framework that I am relying on, because I think in this situation this would be restrictive. So much of my work is really dedicated to discovering those films. but I use various theoretical frameworks to explain the different aspects of the sculpture. So for me, thinkers such as Pierre Bourdieu and Michel Desserteaux have been very important in the descriptions of practices of the everyday. Then I also think about the role of the camera in the society, and in particular, the association of cameras with violence, as described by Susan Sontag, has been important to me. So again, there are so different. There are so many different sides to the movement that I am describing, that I employ a variety of frameworks. Again, Oleg Kharkhordin's work on the Soviet collective also has been important to me, because again, it's not only about filmmaking, but a certain kind of collectives that were cultivated in the Soviet public space.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. This was again Dr. Marija Vinogradova, one among the few, unfortunately, great specialists on the Soviet amateurism and amateur culture, and whose research and work helped us here to build an exhibition on amateur filmmaking. And we hope to see and read your book that is upcoming soon, hopefully in half a year, I don't know, 1 year. How close are you to this? This is the painful question.
It depends on how long I decide to make it. So we'll see.
Okay. Thank you for being with us, for sharing your valuable research and thoughts. And thank you. I am thankful to everyone else who are behind this event, also for helping us to set up this lecture. And I just want to remind those who are with us still that on the 18th and 19th of November, we will have an online academic seminar related to amateurism and amateur filmmaking, and also Dan Strebel and Maria will be there as participants. So I think this is all is said, and yeah, we are closing this event, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Bogdan, and thank you, Alexander. And I am looking forward to the seminar. Again, congratulations on the exhibition.
Ciao, everybody.